Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I am back in the sunflowers today. Before they die off and fall is here for real. I just knocked this one off its stalk while I was setting up, so I thought I'd wear it as long as it stays. Okay, so in the past week or so, I've been seeing this real uptick online, social media, Reddit threads, etc., that it's harder than ever to be a querying writer or a writer on sub. For those of you who aren't familiar with those terms, when you are a querying writer, typically it means you are querying agents, sometimes editors at, the occasional mid-size or smaller, occasionally the biggies, publishers that accept unsolicited or unagented manuscripts, which means you don't have to have an agent to actually send your work to those. Typically, though, being a querying writer typically means you are out there querying agents, trying to get a literary agent. A writer on sub or an author on sub means that you already typically have an agent and your book is being sent out on submission to editors at publishing houses. This sometimes happens in rounds. If it's a manuscript that's going to take a while to sell, if it sells at all, often there are rounds. Agents will start with the top tier publishers that they really want to sell this, to whom they really want to sell this manuscript, and then work their way down the list from there. So again, what I'm seeing online is it's harder than ever, and often these are more established authors who are saying this. So these are authors who have been there, done that. They have books out there already published, some of them for many books for many years. And what they're basically saying, and I think trying to encourage newer aspiring authors, is, hey, if you are one of these people who is querying agents, or you have an agent and your book is out on submission, take heart. It's a really, really, really hard time to do this. Okay, so I have a few reactions to this. I haven't had a book on sub for over a year. I didn't check my exact date before doing this, maybe 2 years. I ended up pulling that submission, that manuscript. It was starting to make the rounds. I was starting to get feedback that already I could tell was just, yeah, this isn't going to go well. And typically the feedback didn't have a lot to do with the quality of the book. It tended to have more to do with subject matter and, oh, we don't know. And I'm not gonna go super into that, but it was essentially in the middle of the pandemic. Basically, COVID was definitely a thing. I had worked really hard on this manuscript. I really loved and still love, by the way, this manuscript. It did tackle some YA issues that I thought were not necessarily edgy, but hadn't really been done in this way before. So I was, and really still am, but was at the time, very excited about it. I was agented at the time. I also ended up deciding to not be agented anymore a while after after I pulled that project. So all of these were very conscious decisions. So I'm coming at this idea of how difficult it is right now for authors from that perspective. I do have a history in the publishing industry. I have 2 traditionally published books. I have 2 indie published books. So I have a little bit of a different take on this. Yes, I do believe it is extremely, extremely difficult to be a new writer querying agents, first of all. Typically, agents are known as the initial gatekeepers. Many of us have heard this term. And then agents have their own gatekeepers. They have to then face the editors at publishing houses, whether it's an acquiring editor who can just grab a project and buy it right there, or whether it's an editor who then has to take the project to a committee of sorts at the publishing house. Agents also face gatekeepers. So traditionally, in traditional publishing, there are these levels of gatekeepers. This is always the way it was. When I was starting out as an author, I was well aware, because I had done my research for many years. I had followed the trends. I had followed the industries. I had studied up on different agents, different editors, what they were looking for. I had looked at the editors of the books I knew and loved. And I can tell you, it was, these gatekeepers were always there, and it was just the accepted way things were. That was sort of it. You either went traditional or you vanity published, which is what self-publishing was known for back then. It was basically known as vanity publishing, and it basically meant you often, here's the image that a lot of people who were there remember, this author showing up at, say, a book convention with a car trunk full of copies of their books that they hoped to hand sell and make back that money and not go home with as many, or hopefully any, of that trunk full of books. Obviously, the self-publishing landscape has completely changed in the years since that was a thing. And so that is completely different. And that sort of tempers my answer a little bit too to this question. Is it more difficult than ever to be starting out? So let me try to get to the answer. It's always been difficult. Is it more difficult than ever? I don't know that it is. I think the landscape of publishing itself has changed so drastically that it's more a question of uncharted waters. For authors who have published books who are now coming out and saying, oh my gosh, it's more difficult than ever, I do think that might be true. And the question sometimes becomes, well, why then? Why is it more difficult? And I'm speaking specifically of traditional publishing here. Why would it be more difficult now than it used to be? We have more information than ever. It's easier to find tips, classes, examples of great query letters than it used to be. I can tell you back in the early 2000s when you needed to check out books and a lot of things were still by snail mail, even though the internet was a thing. A lot of agents didn't want to deal with the internet, so everything was still by snail mail. Wait times were exorbitant then, and I think they are still exorbitant. I tend to think so. Yes, it's still hard. I don't know that it's harder than ever. I think the landscape has changed. I think people's attention spans have completely shrunk. Again, back in my day, it used to be in the early 2000s, you knew things were going to be slow. You were sending queries out on paper and sticking them in the mailbox and then watching your mailbox every single day, or maybe sitting by your phone hoping to get that magical call offering representation. But it would take weeks, months, hopefully not years at that point. I personally would have given up, but months to hear back. Typically what you would get, just like you do today, often a form rejection. Today it's in the form of an email that sometimes comes within a matter of days. Not always though. Back then it was a form rejection on a slip of paper that would show up in your mailbox sometimes months later. One thing I am hearing, there goes my sunflower, authors say is that seems to be a growing trend is agents not responding at all. So you have taken this time to craft a query. Hopefully you are sending it to multiple agents because, again, this process is so slow. But something that seems to be happening is agents just aren't even bothering to respond. On one hand, I can understand that. I think because of the ease of this process now relative to how it used to be, agents are likely completely overwhelmed with queries. My guess is that many of those queries have nothing to do with what the agent even represents. My guess, again, I was never one of these people to do this. I was always really careful because I knew the odds of finding representation were very slim to begin with. It's a tough thing to do. There's a limited number of literary agents out there in the United States, and to try to secure representation from one, that's really hard. It takes luck, it takes timing, it takes having the right project for the right agent. I imagine many of these agents are receiving projects that they don't even represent this genre. I can talk English, or this category in the first place. So they're probably receiving just stuff that is not even for them. So I can understand that there is probably some frustration on the agent end, and why even bother if the people sending these queries didn't even bother, again I'm assuming here, didn't even bother to do their research into what this agent reps. Why would an agent either bother responding? I don't know what's going on with my ability to speak this morning, but I'm just going to roll with it and keep going. So there's that. I think there is agent overwhelm. I also think the market is in such a strange place right now. I don't know. I sort of have my suspicions that nobody really knows what's going to sell. And I also have my suspicions sometimes that maybe it's not even about what will or won't sell. Maybe it's about hitting the perfect zeitgeist moment in time, and that's now what's important to publishers. Maybe it's about delivering the most politically correct message. I don't know. All I know is the publishing landscape that I see now versus the publishing landscape that I knew and studied and really immersed myself back in as an author back in, say, the late 90s, early 2000s, they they bear little to no resemblance to one another. So what has seemed to remain a constant is that it was really tough to break into publishing as an author back then. It's really tough to break into publishing as an author now. What I will say is that while the landscape has completely changed, what has come with that, that I think is a huge benefit to authors, is the options for getting your work out there into the hands of readers. To me, that has always been the end point, the goal. I think it's important for every author, every writer, especially new writers, new writers who are aspiring authors. I distinguish those two. A writer is unpublished, an author is published. That's tends to be a sort of widely accepted definition. It's the one I use, but if I use those words interchangeably, oh well. Um, I think it's really important to ask yourself, what do I want? What is my end goal? Why am I doing this? And especially when it comes to traditional publishing, which is so capricious, has always been capricious to a certain extent, but I think now is just, there's kind of no rhyme or reason to it in my experience and in my opinion. So I think it's more important than ever, especially if you are an author who is in those querying trenches or who has a book on SEP. What do I want here? I knew what I wanted back in the day, because back in the day, boy, you got a traditional publisher, you got an agent and you were on cloud nine. You then got a traditional publisher. That was the dream, baby. And I came of age as a writer in an era where publishers were still sending authors on book tours, paid book tours. They were still doing tons of publicity, even for mid-list authors. Um, to be published by a traditional publisher was the brass ring. And I was fortunate to be published by a great couple of great publishers, but one, you know, at the time, Big Five publisher. And it was a good experience, but it definitely was not what I had seen in authors that I had gone and gone to their signings and seen them read and the whole paid book tour thing. It wasn't quite that. It was already sort of on the downslope. I think now that is almost non-existent. And I'm even hearing from the biggies, the authors who had huge bestsellers. Again, they're now getting onto social media and talking to the up and coming generation of authors saying, hey, hang in there. It's really, 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 really tough. So again, I don't know if I've totally answered the question, but my opinion is, yes, it's really, really, really tough. I don't know that I would say it's tougher than ever. I think the goalposts, the rules, the gatekeepers, and how the gatekeepers present themselves, it's all changed. And I think it feels very capricious. It feels very without rhyme or reason, which was not necessarily the case back in the day. You might not get that brass ring back in the day, but I, you could kind of understand why. You could kind of look at trends and look at what was selling and what the public was asking for, and you could kind of understand why. So that's my start. Those are my starting thoughts on this topic. I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. I have frustrations on this topic, and I also have a lot of hope about this topic of the future of publishing. I think what I see is a sort of post-apocalyptic vision, and that's not always a bad thing, especially when an industry has, and I'm not calling out publishing here, by the way, specifically, any industry has become sort of bloated, has maybe lost its way, has maybe lost its vision and its foundation for why it does what it does, and especially when it has become so focused on growing ever larger, ever more powerful, ever more domineering. Uh, I just think that tends to not result in really happy consequences for anyone, but maybe a very, very select few who are reaping all the power and control and financial benefits of that. That's my idea on it. So again, post-apocalyptic, not necessarily a bad thing if it means another leveling of the playing field. Maybe the playing field is a little bit in rubbles, but then new opportunities come from that. They already are. If you are an author who is really tired of being on the hamster wheel of being out on sub with a project with your agent, or maybe just querying to try to just get an agent in the first place, look into indie publishing. So many writers are doing this these days. That's another conversation. Another thing I'm seeing enter into this particular question of the relative difficulty is so many authors are saying, why would I even do that? Why would I even bother with the traditional dinosaur model of traditional publishing? And again, that gives me great hope, and I enjoyed being a traditionally published author. That was fine, but it's definitely a different era. So if you're feeling yourself almost driven to stop entirely, stop writing, just walking away, don't do that. I would encourage you, look at what is now available and challenge any preconceptions you might have about different avenues of getting your work out there. I'm speaking especially to older authors, because we can tend to have a little bit of a set vision of what it means to be published. I definitely had to overcome some serious how would I say, like biases, some ways I looked at independent publishing, indie publishing, self-publishing. I had a lot of preconceived notions of that, really based on when I came of age in publishing, and how that was known, and what it obviously was back in the day. It's not the same thing, and it does mean a lot more work for you as the author, but there's, as the trade-off, you have complete creative control of your work. You completely own the rights to your work. The time frame for waiting to get your work out there is completely dependent on you. So no longer are you looking at, off at a minimum of 2 years from manuscript acquisition to seeing your book on the shelves, if your book even reaches it to the shelves of your local bookstore, whether it's a big boxer bookstore or big boxer. I don't know what I was trying to say there. Big box bookstore, one of the big brands, or whether it's your local indie. That shelf space is very limited, and there are a lot of books out there being published every day. So again, if you are in those trenches, whether it's the querying trenches or the on sub trenches, my heart goes out to you. Hang in there if that's really your dream. I wouldn't tell you not to do that if that's really your dream. But I would say get clarity with your vision, with why you're doing this, what you hope to achieve at the end, and then research what is typically the outcome for authors going either the traditional path or the indie path. And if you're doing both, you rock. More power to you. I think that's a really viable alternative, and that's kind of what I've fallen into doing, and I think it's a great way to go. So anyway, I hope this was coherent and limited to the scope of that initial question. I kind of went a little bit afield, but it is a ever evolving topic. It's a big topic, and I think there are so many different perspectives, so many different ways to look at this really drastically shifting landscape of publishing. So I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that stuff. I'm trying to grow the channel. And coming back from summer hiatus, I'm trying to hit the ground running. So if there's any clarification you want, or any topics I could cover that would be of interest, let me know. All right. So for now, the sunflowers and I and the hummingbirds are signing off.